Okay, there we are. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, Sunday Fellowship. As you might know, no, you really don't know. Jim's not here. He created a folder called Jim's Not Here. So I am using this folder called Jim's Not Here. Now, he's not here for you guys, but he's here for me because he set this up. So I'm supposed to be able to do this when he's not here. So if you see me look down and do some things, I'm actually running the computer from the podium here. So with that said, we're going to start this morning right now before anything else happens because we had to stop and start it all over again because I missed Brother Jimmy. So anyway, we're going to have Catherine start by reading. Hmm.
Mystery of Sonship, Overcoming Guilt, Shame, and Rejection, Part 3. 1 John 5:4. For all that has been begotten of God gets the victory over the world, and this is the victory which has gotten the victory over the world, our faith. That's Darby version, NET version. Because everyone who has been fathered by God conquers the world. This is the conquering power that has conquered the world, our faith. ESV. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. For the last 2 weeks, we've talked about deliverance over guilt and shame at the cross. This week, we will look at rejection. Rejection is much more powerful and devastating than the other two because it starts in the womb. A child can be rejected even before it's born. The other two, guilt and shame, come from knowledge when someone is older. But even with rejection, God has provided a way of escape. What does it take to overcome these three powerful captors to our emotional needs? First, rejection is rooted and grounded in the past. It, too, has the power to keep the human host attached to and one with the personal identity of the flesh. And just as the other two, this captor's source of fear, keeping it all working together for everyone's ongoing captivity, is again the spirit of fear. What is the answer to these powerful captors? Is it the cross of Christ? The power of the cross is visible to all who need its help. The cross of Christ can be the beginning of freedom and power to overcome rejection. But yet, the cross, lacks one important thing. Let's find out.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. As Catherine read to you, we looked at the cross and its effect on guilt and shame. As I said last week, as we closed with the word on shame, the cross is very powerful, and the cross will have some effect on rejection, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But I want to just say one thing about the introversions, which I didn't say when Catherine was reading it. But the most important thing is overcoming. Now, what we discussed last week with you at the end of the message last week, we talked about uh, body and soul and how the cross brings about deliverance. We will talk about that in a few minutes when it comes to rejection. But the cross brings about deliverance from something. Deliverance deals with body and soul. So, with that said, I'm going to ask Catherine to go back and read a little bit more of the notes.
Rejection. Rejection is the deepest wound of all human dilemmas and issues many face. It can be a cruel and ugly captor. Unlike guilt, shame comes to bury you under its thick blanket of darkness and suffocating fear. Shame can carry with it deep anger and bitterness towards others and even oneself, and in many cases lead to a wounded psyche. But rejection brings with it a wounded spirit. This deals with one's value and worth to others. What is rejection? Let's look at the definition of rejection. Merriam-Webster. The action of rejecting, the state of being rejected, an immune response in which foreign tissue, as of a tissue graft or transplanted organ, is attacked by the immune system components of the recipient organism, something rejected.
Hold on a minute. Uh, Okay. No. I wanted to let's go back to the notes. I want to show this for just 1 second. It's not working the way I want to work here. Anyway, huh? Okay. Go back to that little line here, um, right here on transplants. We all know that our brother Curtis, and I thank all of you for your prayers that you've lifted up to the Father for him during this time, and Jenny as well. But this is one of the things about rejection. In transplant surgery, you will see, uh, as Curtis is going through, the 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 how do I say this? The act of the new organ that has been transplanted having a rejection, being rejected. It's attacked by the immune system, and because it's attacked by the immune system, it can reject the new organ that comes in. Those of you who've heard the story, me sharing the revelation of Christ or the revelation of sonship that the Father provided for me some years ago, many years ago now, one of the things he said at the very end of that revelation was, "Let me show you your worst enemy." And I think those of you who've been with us, you've heard me share this before, but I'm saying it now for context purposes. That uh, he showed me the body I live in. My worst enemy I thought was the devil, was Satan. It is the body I live in. But the reason he said that, he gave it to me in terms in which I understood with my surgical background. He said a heart. He said a heart transplant. The heart is a new heart in an old body, and the body will do all it can to reject the new heart, even if that heart keeps the body alive. And so that's what rejection is about. It's about rejecting something that does not fit into the character or the identity that we are as a person. But I'll let Catherine continue to read the notes.
Rejected. Not given approval or acceptance. Medical, marked by or exhibiting immunological rejection. Rejection affects a vast majority of humanity today. Whether you declare being a believer in Jesus, a non-believer, a churchgoer, or not, some may even declare they are born again, saved, have Jesus living in their heart, or Jesus lives in them as their only life. Yet none of these matter, because rejection, just as guilt and shame, is not a respecter of your personal declarations. You might not have absorbed the love God provided you. You might not have ever really known his love deep within your heart and spirit, loving you for who you are to him personally.
Let me pause with that for a second. Let's pause with that for a second. Rejection has to do with something to do with love. Rejection has to do, no matter what you no matter what you declare, as the notes have said, no matter what you declare, whether you're born again, whether you believe in God, whether you don't believe in God, whether Christ lives in you or Jesus lives in your heart, none of those things really matter, because those are your personal declarations. But with all of that said, if Christ lives in me, he's my only life. I've heard that. We've talked about that in the past. But that personal declaration does not free you from guilt, shame, and rejection. Why is that? Why does those declarations not free you? Because we don't understand that. Because fear motivates all of those. Even rejection, fear motivates all of those. But there's one thing that dominates or takes care of fear, and that's love. And so with all those declarations, I've known people, and you might have known people, that quote, love God, who love their families, who use the word love, but have never come to receive and understand the power of that love. They've not walked in a love that ministers not only to them but through them to others. So Catherine, as she read that, it brought to my mind that many of us have not known the love that God has given us. Oh, and I'm not talking about God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. If you receive Jesus, you receive his love. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the love that you actually know that liberates you from everything else that goes on around you. But we'll get to that in just a second. Let's go back to the notes.
Mother Teresa wrote in her book, "Not being loved is the worst sickness." I agree with her statement. This is truly the source and foundation of the wounded spirit of rejection. There are some listening to this message right now who are infected with this sickness.
Let me pause. Some right now are infected with the disease of a wounded spirit, the wounded spirit of rejection. Before I take that, I'm going to let Catherine finish reading this statement. Go ahead, finish reading for me, please, honey.
The vast majority of people in the United States suffer from the sickness of the wounded spirit of rejection. It is the number one sickness in the country and in the world today. It is an epidemic level, far worse than COVID-19.
Let's pause. It is far worse than COVID-19. This sickness of the wounded spirit of rejection is the most dominating thing that's happening to humanity today. Most of the things you see going on in the world today, in America, around the world, is this thing that's happening with human beings. It's an epidemic. But people don't see it that way. They don't understand why you might say, what happened? You might say that I'm free. What makes people do what they're doing in the world today? But this is what you see happening around you. In many cases, it is the fear that operates in a wounded spirit of rejection. That's why people talk about freedom as though they understand what they're talking about. But I will ask Catherine to continue to read for me. Hang on a minute. Let me get this out. So you can read it. Okay, please go on.
Proverbs 18:14. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity, but a wounded spirit who can bear? Rejection can start in many places with various causes. Let's look at just a few causes of rejection. Baby rejected in the womb. Embryos have their spiritual senses heightened in the womb. They can sense rejection. They are one with their parents. School is a place where rejection can start in a child's life. Last week during the message on shame, I used a term called fat shaming, which can lead to rejection. Breakup of a marriage can cause family members to feel rejection. Parents who are unable to love their babies or children produce rejection. Every baby born into the world craves one thing above all else: love. Some parents don't know how to express or manifest their love. Unexpressed love does a baby or child no good.
Let me pause with that. Unexpressed love does a baby or a child no good. And I want to go back to what Catherine was saying here in the beginning. Parents who are unable to love their babies or children produce rejection. We all grew up, let me change this, go back. We all grew up in different households. We all grew up in different families. We all grew up with an idea that the family we were in loved us. Some of us might not have thought that the way we were chasing sometimes. But our idea and conception of love was based on what we received from the environment we were in. Now, that holds true to the idea that you are a product of your environment, so to speak. But that's temporary. It is temporary. But until that is taken care of, our understanding of love comes from the environment we grew up in. So if the people we grew up around, the people who were parents or the people who were responsible for raising us did not understand love as one, a person, and two, as spiritual, then their understanding of that was skewed. That's what they passed on to you and I. Your parents passed on. If they were very loving and hugging and touching, you came out of an environment that had that. If they did not do that, if they didn't show that, if love to your parents or the house you grew up in was putting food on the table and keeping a roof over your head and putting clothes on your back and shoes on your feet, if that was love to them, that's the love you're going to demonstrate today. That's the environment you came up in. You cannot escape that because that was built into, which we'll get to in a minute, your personality. You find some people who are cold toward others. That comes from the environment they grew up in, their understanding of love. You don't touch each other. You don't do this. You don't, I mean, there's a vast majority of the world today that operate in this spirit of wounded spirit of rejection that comes from people, parents, grandparents, who they grew up with, who expressed the love that was common to them. That's what we're saying. That's what this message is. What Catherine just read you. So let's go back to that, babe. Let's go back to that for a second.
Some never show their emotions or affections, which creates a cold spot between the parent and child. This cold spot can produce a stunted and deformed personality in the child's personal identity.
Now pause. This stunted personality, this cold spot, whatever spot it is not I'm not saying it's wrong or that it's right. I'm just saying it's there because if you can't give something that you don't have. Let me say it again. You can't give something that you don't have. And so with that in mind, if you can't give something you don't have, it creates a space, a void that needs to be filled. And so that space produces, as we were saying here, that space produces a stunted or deformed personality in the child's personal identity. As you look at me, you have a personal identity that's part of your soul mind, part of your body and soul identity. And I'm not talking about your spiritual identity, even because that's a separate deal. Even though you're born again, even though you're the spiritual son of God by spiritual birth, you have a personal identity that is formed by body and soul that you operate from. That personal identity has a personality. That personality comes from where you came from, the home you grew up in, the things your parents believe, the things you believe. There's many people today who have trouble loving their husbands, their wives, their children, their spouses, their friends. They can't give themselves freely because that's a cold spot. They didn't grow up. They didn't grow up like that. They were stunted in the expression of love. Please go on.
The child can and will pass on that wounded spirit of rejection because they have never known anything else. Love never had its perfect way. Something that is not expressed is something that is suppressed.
Now listen to that again. Something that is not expressed is something that is suppressed. So if you don't express it, it is suppressed. Let's go.
Lastly, there is self-rejection. This is where the rejection of others and the unfulfilled need of love attacks one's value and self-worth. Let's just see how far back rejection goes. How did the cross deliver man from rejection? God's rejection of man? And what about man's rejection of God? There are several places in the Bible to start with as we look at rejection. Let's look at the first man who received rejection. Genesis 4:2-7. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, thou shalt not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him.
Now let me pause with that for just a second. I want to use this as the first act of rejection. Now the word here is respect. In Hebrew, it means two things. One is opposite of the other. One is to inspect. One is to countenance. One is to dismay. But if you see this, and I use this because I looked at this as God rejecting Cain's and his offering. But I saw this as I was studying that this past week, that God didn't reject Cain. He didn't reject Cain. What did he reject? His offering. He rejected his offering. He rejected what he said before God. He didn't reject Cain. But instead, because Cain was hurt, Cain had a wounded spirit. God tells him here, why are you angry? That's part of a wounded spirit. He didn't get acceptance. He didn't receive what he thought he should receive from God. He was hurt. And so what did that hurt do? It drove him to do what? Catherine said, drove him to the dark side. What did it do? It drove him to be angry at God, but to take it out on his brother. That's what a wounded spirit will do. That's what a wounded spirit of rejection will do. It will cause many to take things out on others that they themselves are not receiving that they want. They wanted something. He wanted something from God. He wanted God's approval. He wanted God's love. God never took his love from Cain, but Cain saw his works as a basis for his identity. He saw his works. That's why in verse 7, if thou doest well, shall not thou be accepted? That has to do with his works, not him personally. But you see, there's a place in Cain that is a place in every human being, a place that needs to be fulfilled by love, a place that cannot be satisfied without love, a place that rejection becomes overwhelming. It creates, in this case, a wounded spirit of rejection, and in that he went out, as we know, and killed his brother. So let's continue to read.
Israel rejection of God's love, freedom, and leadership. 1 Samuel 8, 4-9. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Pause. Look at that. Now, they didn't waste any time. They said to Brother Samuel, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now, I'm going to hit a little bit in this in a few minutes, but I wanted you to see, I highlighted this for a reason. This is what's happening. This is what happens when you don't understand love. You're not receiving something you think you want. In this case, they wanted to be like everybody else. And so they felt they were being rejected by the rest of the nation, so they wanted to be like them. We're looking at a wounded spirit of rejection here from the people of Israel. They wanted to be like everybody else, so they demanded that Samuel, now make us a king to judge us like everybody else. We don't want to be like, we don't want to be different. We don't want to be set apart. We don't want to be sanctified. We don't want to be set unto God. We don't want to be his chosen people. We want to be like everybody else on the planet. That's the word nations mean. It means Gentiles. All the other nations. All the other nations. We are rejecting. We are rejected by them, so make us a king so that we can be like everybody else. But you know something about that idea? You know something about that idea? Let's read on, baby.
But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me.
Hold on. Pause. Look at that. Samuel was displeased. He understood what they were saying, but he knew they didn't understand what they were saying. Now you see that. You see that today. People will tell you about their parents, about how they're treating others, how they want to be like everybody else. Why should they be different? In this context, Israel is saying, we don't want God's leadership and love. We want to be free. We want to be free. He's denying our freedom to be like everybody else. Sadly, that's going on today. Sadly, in churches today, people who don't understand who they are spiritually, people don't understand their need to be completed by God. Not just by God, but the one who wants to be a father to them. Hopefully we'll get to how important the father is in this. But it says, God says to Samuel, they have not rejected you, brother. It's not you. It's not about you. It's not about them rejecting you. They have rejected me. And if you notice that, that's all in the past tense. If you look that up in the Hebrew, both of those words rejected in the past tense. They're not talking about something they want for the future. They already made up their mind what they want. They just asking them to make it happen. That's what rejection will do to you. When you're in a wounded spirit of rejection, you want something to relieve that now. You want in this case, they wanted freedom from God. Freedom from his listen, freedom from his leadership, freedom from his love. They wanted flesh and blood to do it for them. Let's go on, please.
They have rejected me that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods. So do they also unto thee.
Now pause. He's letting them know what God has done for Israel. I brought them up out of Egypt, even until this day, wherewith they have forsaken me. They've turned from me and served other gods. So do they also unto thee. In other words, what they're doing unto me, they're doing unto you. They're rejecting you as well. Let's keep going.
Now therefore hearken unto their voice. Howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them.
Let me interject something right here before we read on. Now, they hadn't learned anything from Numbers in the wilderness. This people hadn't learned anything. They didn't remember. They didn't remember. Be careful what you ask for. Why? Because you just might get it. Be careful what you ask for. They asked for meat. God said, okay, I'll give it to them, and I'll give it to them till it come out of their noses. Be careful what you ask for. They wanted a king. So this is what God said to tell, he said, hearken unto their voice. Hearken unto their voice. That's a bad sign, guys. That's a bad, when you're in a wounded spirit of rejection, you really don't want anybody to listen to you. Because you're asking for the wrong things. You're asking for more children when you really don't need any more children. You're asking for more money on the job. You really don't need more money. You're asking for more stuff, more cars, more this, more that. That's not what you need. Be careful what you ask for. So let's take a look at what happens.
We see man rejected their God for a man whom they wanted to make them like all the other nations. The consequences of rejection to God. 1 Samuel 8:10 through 22.
Now, we're not going to read all of the verses. I'm just going to have just start off, but I just want you to read the things that I underline. So just start off with what Samuel said.
The underlined.
No. Start with
Okay, and Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king.
Okay, now, Samuel is about to unload on them.
And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots, and he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and his instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take...
Now pause. This portion here about the fields, and they already had to offer up tithe unto God. They were already doing that. They were already giving God. But Samuel is telling him, hey, it's going to cost you more than that. You think you tithing now? Wait. That's more you're going to lose. Keep going.
He will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and
that's a tithe,
and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your manservants and your maidservants and your godliest young men and your asses and put them to his work.
You're going to take their asses?
That's what it says.
Okay.
And he will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day.
Uh-oh.
Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us.
Wait, hold on.
We will also be made like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.
That our king might go out before us and fight our battle. Listen to this. Let me pop in here for a second. Do you hear what these people have just said? Samuel told them all of this stuff was going to happen. And it says in verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of truth. Where are you getting your truth from? I said that last couple of weeks. I said it every week because I enjoy saying it. Where are you getting your truth from? Facebook? Twitter? TikTok? What's Instagram? Where are you getting your truth from? Maybe some secret website. When the voice of the word of God is spoken to these people, it says they refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said nay, which means no. No matter what you say, we're not going. You hear that today. You remember I said earlier? You're listening to the voice of a wounded spirit of rejection in many people today. Deals with their identity, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. You're hearing the same thing today in religion and politics. You're hearing these words. Where are you getting your truth from? They said, we made up our mind. Nothing you can say going to change our mind about us having a king. We want a king. We want somebody to rule over us so we can be like everybody else and to judge us. And to go to, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard in this passage. Look at that verse there in verse 20. And go out before us and fight our battles. Is that knucklehead or what? God was fighting your battles, and now you want a man to do what God did? Jimmy, help a brother out. You want a man to do what God was doing. The God of creation, you don't want him to do it anymore. You want this man to go out in front of you and fight your battles. But wait, let me show you something that's just amazing to me. Let's read some more, Catherine.
And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in his ears, in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, Go ye every man unto his city.
Now, I want you to read this right here. It's verse 24.
And Samuel said to all the people, See ye him whom the Lord hath chosen, and there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king! God save the king! What?
Don't you think that's a knucklehead statement? In the wounded spirit of rejection, these people say, and all the people shouted, God save the king. You don't want God, but you want him to save the king. What? You don't want him to fight your battles, but you want him to save the king that goes out in front and fight the battles with you or for you. What? You want him to do something that he was doing for you, but you want him to do it to the king. The wounded spirit of rejection does not make sense because it cannot. Keep reading.
Now let's look at the word rejection in the New Testament. Luke 9:22, saying, The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be slain and be raised on the third day. Luke 17:25, But first must he suffer many things and be rejected of his generation. Luke 20:17, And he beheld them and said, What is this then that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner. The cross, place of rejection. But the rejection of whom? 70 years before
That's 700.
700 years before the cross, the prophet Isaiah said this concerning the cross and rejection. Isaiah 53:3, He is despised and rejected of men.
Now pause. He is despised and rejected of men. That's important. Now this is between what you saw in 1 Samuel. Isaiah is speaking through the same spirit that Samuel spoke, and it says here, he is rejected of men. Now, God was already rejected of men in Israel back when it's in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So here again, he is giving us a look into the future of rejection of men again. Keep reading.
He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not.
Now again, it says we hid our faces. Nay, we don't want to hear what you got to say, but that's okay. Let's keep going.
Again, men reject God's love for a man to judge them and give them freedom. Matthew 26:57-59-60, And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came 2 false witnesses.
Now, I was going to say something about this, but the time won't let me talk about these last two. These last two that have bought into the spirit of the wounded spirit of rejection. But I don't have time. Let's keep going. Yes, most of them are.
Mark 15, 1 through 15. And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answering said unto him, Thou sayest it. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witnessed against thee. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at that feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named
Barabbas.
Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection.
Pause. Now, the writer here is establishing something. He's establishing something in which most of you have read this passage should already know. But right now, you're looking at the same thing that happened in 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8 said the leaders of Israel came to Samuel and wanted him to make them a king to rule over them. They wanted someone to set them free from God, to set them free, to be able to, so they could live the way they thought they should live like all the other nations. Well, you're looking at this here at the same place. The leaders of the Jewish people came to Pilate, which was a Gentile, and offered up Jesus for him to be, well, for him, they really brought him up to him to have him kill him. But it says here that Pilate had the power to release one man, a prisoner unto them, one prisoner. And this is what they did. They wanted Barabbas. He was what? An insurrectionist. He was the one who thought that the way to free Israel was to overthrow Rome. That's when you don't understand what freedom is, you need to make it up as you go. And this fellow, along with all the rest of them, it says, bound with them that made insurrection with him, who committed murder. He was the murderer in the group. But they believed that they were going to overthrow the government of Rome so that they could be free of Roman rule. I think we've heard that somewhere. Again, when you don't understand love, you have to make up freedom. You got to make it up. Freedom is just what you perceive it to be, because love right now is what you perceive it. So they asked for Barabbas. What else does that say?
And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priest had delivered him for envy. But the chief priest moved the people, that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye that then that I shall do unto him, whom you call the King of the Jews?
Now, wait a minute, hang on. Wait. They wanted a king to rule over, right? They wanted a king. Here he is. Here he is. Here's the king. That's what they wanted. But they don't want this king. They don't want the one, again, God provided. They wanted one that promised them something apart from God. They wanted someone that would give them something that they could get apart from God. What was that? Barabbas. Or who was that? Barabbas. There's a lot of people today looking for Barabbases. They're calling on Barabbas. So Pilate says, then what shall I do with whom ye call the King of the Jews? He's from the line of David. He has kingly blood in his flesh. But you know what they said right here? We reject him like we did his father. We reject him like we did his father. And again they cried out, crucify him. What else did Pilate say? Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? That's like his daddy, like God the Father. What did God do to Israel? What did he do to Israel? That's what a loving father would do. But they don't want to be held accountable. Not the accountability that they should receive. They wanted something else. They wanted a man. But they didn't want this man. They wanted somebody like them. Somebody who believed that Rome was keeping them back. They didn't realize God had the plan. He gave them someone, his son, his first begotten, that will liberate them, not only from Rome, but from the bondage of corruption. Keep going.
And they cried out the more exceedingly, crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. Don't just think it was Israel only who rejected Jesus. John 1:10-11, and he was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not.
Now let's pause with that just 1 second. He came to his own, and his own received him not. Let me scroll up just a little bit. Right there, yeah. And his own received him not. Now, that could be taken in both ways. First, his own was the people of Israel, right? But it says here, he was in the world, and and the world was made by him. So that included everybody. That included Jews and Gentiles, don't you think, Catherine? That includes everybody. So this verse can be taken for both. He came to his own, to Israel, which he said he did. And Matthew, 99% of the book of Matthew deals with Jesus coming to Israel. I come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The children, I shouldn't feed the bread of the children to the dogs. Go to all of Israel, but don't go to the Gentiles or the way of to the Samaritans or the way of the Gentiles. So all of that has to do with Israel. But yet, he created all things. He made, and the world was made by him. That included the Gentiles as well. So guess what? When Pilate and Herod rejected him, that was part of that. So he came to his own, and his own were what? Rejected him, received him not. They rejected him. Humanity rejected him. Again, God is being rejected, but that's part of the plan. Let's keep going.
Because of the cross, we can see God accepted mankind, and there was no rejection from him. At the cross, mankind can see deliverance from the rejection of men. Paul tells us this in the book of Ephesians 1:4-6. According as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love.
Pause. Let me interject. I want you to see something in that verse. I want you to see something. You might already know this. For those of you who already know this, you can just say amen. For those of you who don't know this, let me read this to you once again so you can see what's being said here. Paul said, he has chosen us in him, he being the Father, has chosen us in Christ, or the Son, before the foundation of the world. That means before humans were created, they were already chosen to be what God intended them to be to him, that we should be holy. Now, that's not we should be, that we should become holy. That when we were created, we would be holy. Not something you do after creation. This says that we should be holy. In other words, after God created us, this is before the foundation. So after creation, men were set apart unto God. In their creation, they were set apart unto God. And without blame, before him in love. So this took place before the world, set apart to God. No one could say anything about him. No one could say anything to God about men, including Satan, including Lucifer, that would change his mind about who men are to him, because men were created before him in love. He had the reason they were created was love. So there was no rejection of men on God's part. As I told you before, last 2 weeks, there's a difference between being guilty before God, being shamed before God, and being rejected before God. That did not happen because before the foundation of the world, all three of those were taken care of. Before we were created, there's no man that's guilty before God. There's no man that's shamed before God. There's no man that's rejected by God. Now, we see that played out at the cross, but people don't understand this. So this verse is talking about before creation, before the foundation of the world, men were holy. They were without blame, and they were already in presence of God by love, because it's his love that brought about their creation. Keep going.
Having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, wherein he hath made us accepted in the beloved.
See that? See that? He has made us accepted in the beloved. When? Before. There was no rejection. He accepted us even before we were created, because it says we were chosen in him before the foundation of the world. Because of that, he has made us accepted in himself, as which Catherine read there, by Jesus Christ to himself, according to his good pleasure, to the praise of his glory, his grace. I don't think we see that. Many people walk around in rejection and think God has something to do with it. Hopefully we'll get to that in just a second. Let's keep going. Because I want to be able to finish this.
The cross only deals with 2/3 of man's issue with guilt, shame, and rejection. There is a way of escape for guilt and shame which deals with the body and soul, including the heart. The cross provides deliverance from guilt and shame. This deliverance is temporary. The cross cannot and does not cause a person to overcome. The cross is God's instrument of death. The cross is the foreknowledge of God, is a new death in which God provides a stepping stone for the opportunity to overcome. This is why rejection is much different than guilt and shame. So rejection is handled differently by the Spirit of God. And although the cross is used in part for rejection, it's not the answer for rejection. So what then is the answer for the wounded spirit of rejection? The answer is in an exchanged identity. Not just any identity, but the receiving a new spiritual identity. It is becoming another person spiritually to God himself.
Remember, to himself. That this has to do with something he purposed in himself, something he purposed to himself.
Becoming another person spiritually to God himself, the spiritual Son of the Father. Why? Because the wounded spirit of rejection can never be healed.
Let me say that again. Let me pop in there for a minute. The wounded spirit of rejection can never be healed. Let me say it again. All those of you who I believe in healing. I don't believe in healing. I live that way. I practice that. I live out that. I know the Father heals. But this is something he does not heal. Let me say it again. The wounded spirit of rejection can never be healed, as in guilt and shame. Guilt and shame can be, you can receive a healing for that. It's temporary, but you can receive healing for that. Wounded spirit, you can't receive healing for that. It cannot be healed because it's spiritual. Let's read on.
The spirit of man, which was given by God, was not created, as were the body and soul. The spirit of man can only be completed, not healed.
Thank you. Say it again. The spirit of man can only be completed and not healed. That's why those with a wounded spirit of rejection cannot be delivered.
And it can only be completed by God the Father himself. No one can accomplish this act of completion. No belief system, no religious activities, no declarations of proclamations, no laying on of hands, and no works, no law keeping will free humankind from the wounded spirit of rejection. It must be overcome.
Okay, I'm going to end right there. There we go. I'm going to end right there. And so we will conclude it next week with overcoming. We got some things to deal with overcoming. I guess you saw that. Yes. Yes. That's okay, Catherine. Leave it alone. It's not. It's alt, honey. It's on the left. Okay. Don't worry about it. We'll leave it that way. That's okay, babe. It's good. Because you just hold the alt down and push the tab. Hold it down. No, just hold it. There you go. Now. There we go. Thank you. She did it. You can't see what she did, but you will see what she did. Anyway, we've talked about the last 3 weeks about overcoming. I've given you nothing about overcoming guilt, shame, and rejection. I have given you deliverance that comes with guilt and shame. We talked today to you about rejection, the wounded spirit of rejection, how it's inherent in many human beings, how people have been rejected by one another by the rejection of men, not by God, which we talked about today. God has not rejected men. Why? Because he chose us before he created us in Christ. He chose us to be that way. He chose us to himself. But he provided a way of escape for all three, especially the wounded spirit of rejection, by overcoming. And because it's spiritual, it happens within the spirit. It doesn't happen in the soul, mind. It doesn't happen in the flesh. It happens spiritually. So next week, Lord willing, I will conclude all of this with overcoming and what it means to be an overcomer. That which is born of God overcomes the world. And we're going to touch some things we haven't shared with you guys before about spiritual birth. At least, I don't think we have. We've covered this ground so many times. I have, Curtis have, Dwight has. Many of us have discussed these things with you guys over the course of several years. But we're going to conclude next week with the power of overcoming. And with that said, I thank you guys for being with us this morning. We trust the Father to see you next Sunday.